What if I tell you that 1 out of 5 truck drivers do have their own scary stories to tell about? In fact, almost every truck drivers do have their scary paranormal experiences. If you don't believe me, go pick 5 truck drivers and ask them about any paranormal stuffs they have experienced so far. You will be amazed, while at the same time, scared, of the scary stories they will share with you. Tonight, I will share 5 truck drivers' scary stories for you. So grab a cup of coffee, plug your earphones, sit down, and enjoy the stories. Jake Fisher had been a trucker for over 2 decades, traversing the vast highways and lonely backroads of America. He thought he had seen and heard it all, until the night he encountered the phantom radio. It was a typical Tuesday night, and Jake was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Denver. The interstate stretched out before him, a seemingly endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dark, empty landscape. The cab of his truck was his sanctuary, filled with the hum of the engine and the steady drone of his radio tuned to a local country station. As the miles rolled by and the hours ticked away, Jake found himself growing increasingly drowsy. He reached for his thermos, taking a long sip of the lukewarm coffee. The caffeine helped, but he knew he needed something more to keep him alert. He fiddled with the dial on his radio, searching for a talk show or something engaging enough to stave off the encroaching fatigue. Suddenly, the radio crackled with static. Jake frowned and adjusted the dial again, hoping to find a clear signal. Instead, the static grew louder, filling the cab with its harsh, grating noise. He was about to give up and switch off the radio when a voice emerged from the static, clear and eerie. "Breaker 19. This is the Phantom. Do you read me?" Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had heard plenty of trucker ghost stories over the years, but he had never experienced anything like this. He hesitated, then picked up his CB microphone. "This is Big Jake. Who's out there?" There was a long pause, and then the voice came through again, cold and detached. "Big Jake, you need to turn back. There's danger ahead." Jake's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He glanced at the GPS mounted on his dashboard, which showed nothing but empty road for miles ahead. "What kind of danger?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Turn back now," the voice insisted. "It's your only chance." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard stories of phantom truckers warning drivers of impending accidents, but he had always dismissed them as urban legends. Now, he wasn't so sure. "I can't just turn back," he replied. "I've got a delivery to make." The static returned, louder and more insistent. Jake winced as it filled the cab. Then the voice came through once more, softer this time. "You've been warned, Big Jake. Don't say I didn't warn you." With that, the radio went silent. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding and glanced around the cab, half expecting to see a ghostly figure sitting beside him. But he was alone, the road stretching out endlessly before him. He tried to shake off the encounter, convincing himself it was just a prank or a trick of his tired mind. But the words of the phantom voice lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. As the miles passed, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. 2 hours later, Jake was driving through a remote section of the Rockies. The road twisted and turned through the mountains, flanked by sheer cliffs on one side and steep drop-offs on the other. The night had grown darker, and a thick fog had begun to roll in, obscuring his view. Jake's hands were clenched around the steering wheel, his eyes straining to see through the fog. The radio had been silent since the Phantom's warning, and the silence in the cab was oppressive. He was just starting to relax, convincing himself that the worst was over, when the radio crackled to life again. "Big Jake, this is the Phantom. Do you read me?" Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He grabbed the microphone, his voice tight with tension. "This is Big Jake. What do you want?" "You didn't turn back," the voice said, almost mournfully. "Now it's too late." A surge of fear coursed through Jake. He glanced at the road ahead, his headlights barely penetrating the thick fog. Suddenly, his truck's headlights caught a glimpse of something in the distance. A shadowy figure stood in the middle of the road, waving frantically. Jake slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the truck skidded to a halt. He squinted through the windshield, trying to make out the figure. It was a woman, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Help me!" she screamed, her voice barely audible over the rumble of the engine. Jake didn't hesitate. He unbuckled his seatbelt and jumped out of the cab, rushing towards the woman. "What's wrong?" he called out. "There's been an accident," she gasped. "My car went off the road. My husband is still trapped inside." Jake's blood ran cold. He followed the woman's gaze and saw the twisted wreckage of a car at the bottom of a steep ravine, barely visible through the fog. Without a second thought, he scrambled down the slope, the woman close behind him. When they reached the car, Jake could see the driver's side was crumpled against a tree. He peered through the shattered window and saw a man slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious but still breathing. "We need to get him out of there," Jake said, adrenaline fueling his actions. With the woman's help, Jake managed to pry open the passenger door and carefully pulled the man from the wreckage. They carried him up the slope, the fog swirling around them like a living thing. As they reached the top, Jake heard the distant wail of sirens. He turned to the woman, ready to ask her more questions, but she was gone. He spun around, searching the fog, but there was no sign of her. The ambulance arrived, moments later, and the paramedics took over, tending to the injured man. Jake watched in a daze, his mind racing with questions. Who was the woman? How had she disappeared so quickly? As the paramedics loaded the man into the ambulance, one of them approached Jake. "You're lucky you found him when you did," the paramedic said. "Another few minutes, and he might not have made it." Jake nodded absently, his thoughts still on the phantom voice and the mysterious woman. As the ambulance drove away, he climbed back into his truck, the events of the night replaying in his mind. He glanced at the radio, half expecting to hear the phantom's voice again. But the cab was silent, the only sound the steady hum of the engine. Jake took a deep breath and started the truck, easing back onto the road. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but the encounter left a lasting impression on Jake. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been guided by something beyond his understanding, something that had saved his life and the life of the man in the wreckage. Years later, Jake would still tell the story of the phantom radio, of the warning that came through the static, and the mysterious woman who had appeared out of the fog. Some truckers believed him, while others dismissed it as just another ghost story. But Jake knew what he'd experienced was real, and it was a night he would never forget. As he continued his journey, he kept the radio on, listening for the voice that had saved him. And though he never heard the phantom again, he drove with a new sense of caution, always mindful of the warnings that might come through the static and the unseen forces that watched over the lonely highways of the night. The night was a perfect shroud for fear. A dense fog rolled over the countryside, swallowing the winding roads of rural Kentucky. Evan Reed, a seasoned trucker with a decade behind the wheel, had seen all kinds of strange things on his nocturnal hauls, but tonight had an air of unease he couldn't shake. Evan was hauling a load of produce to a distribution center several states away. He had planned to stop at a truck stop an hour back, but the mist seemed to urge him onward, wrapping around his truck like a spectral embrace. He turned on his CB radio, hoping for some friendly chatter to cut through the oppressive silence. "Breaker 19, this is Knight Rider. Anybody out there?" he called. Only static answered. He frowned and kept driving, the road ahead barely visible in his high beams. The isolation gnawed at him, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 3:12 a.m. As he navigated a particularly sharp bend, his headlights caught a figure standing by the roadside, arm outstretched in a classic hitchhiker pose. Evan's heart skipped a beat. It was unusual to see anyone out here, especially at this hour. He slowed the truck, curiosity and caution warring within him. The figure became clearer as he approached. A young woman in a white dress, her hair cascading over her shoulders. She looked out of place, almost ethereal, and Evan couldn't just leave her out there alone. He pulled over and rolled down the passenger window. "Need a lift?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The woman nodded, her eyes wide and filled with something that looked like fear or sorrow. She climbed into the cab without a word, settling into the seat and clasping her hands in her lap. Evan studied her for a moment before pulling back onto the road. "I'm Evan," he offered, hoping to break the silence. "Where are you headed?" "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just up the road." Evan nodded and focused on driving, though he couldn't help but steal glances at his passenger. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her dress looked like something from a bygone era. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Lila," she replied, her gaze fixed straight ahead. A chill ran down Evan's spine at the simplicity of her response. Something about this whole situation felt off, but he couldn't pinpoint what it was. He tried to push the thought aside, focusing on the road ahead. They drove in silence for several miles. The fog grew thicker, wrapping around the truck and muting the world outside. Evan felt a growing sense of dread, as if the mist were a living thing, slowly tightening its grip. "Why were you out there alone?" he asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Lila turned to look at him, her eyes dark and sorrowful. "I was waiting." "Waiting for what?" Evan pressed. She hesitated, then said, "For someone to help me." Evan's unease deepened. He tried to think of another question, something to break the eerie atmosphere. But before he could speak, the CB radio crackled to life. "Night Rider, this is Shadow Walker. Do you copy?" Evan grabbed the microphone, grateful for the distraction. "This is Night Rider. Go ahead, Shadow Walker. Be careful out there, Night Rider. There's been talk of strange things on that road. Phantom hitchhikers, they say. Folks who pick them up don't always make it to their destination." Evan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He glanced at Lila, who stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. "Thanks for the warning, Shadow Walker," Evan said, his voice tense. "I'll keep an eye out. Safe travels, Night Rider. Shadow Walker out." The radio fell silent, leaving a heavy tension in the cab. Evan felt a knot of fear tighten in his chest. He had heard stories about phantom hitchhikers, spirits trapped between worlds, seeking passage to the afterlife. But he had always dismissed them as just that. Stories. "Is something wrong?" Lila asked, her voice cutting through his thoughts. Evan shook his head, forcing a smile. "No, everything's fine. Just some spooky trucker tales." Lila's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she turned back to the road. The silence resumed, more oppressive than ever. Minutes later, Evan noticed a sign for a small town up ahead. Relieved, he decided to drop Lila off there. As they approached the town, the fog seemed to thicken, obscuring everything except for the road directly in front of them. Evan slowed the truck, squinting through the mist. The buildings emerged from the fog like specters, their shapes barely discernible. He pulled into what looked like the main street and stopped in front of a dimly lit diner. "This is as far as I go," he said, turning to Lila. "You can get some help here." Lila looked at the diner, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Evan." She opened the door and stepped out into the fog. Evan watched her walk towards the diner, her figure fading into the mist. He waited until she disappeared from view before heaving a sigh of relief and pulling away from the curb. As he drove through the fog-shrouded streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The town seemed deserted, the buildings dark and lifeless. He glanced at the clock, 3:45 a.m. Too late for any place to be so devoid of activity. A sudden movement caught his eye. He slammed on the brakes as a figure stepped into the road. It was Lila, standing in the middle of the street, her dress glowing faintly in the mist. Evan's blood ran cold. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping out of the truck. "Lila?" he called, his voice trembling. She didn't respond. Instead, she raised her arm and pointed down the road towards an old, decrepit house at the end of the street. Evan approached her cautiously. "What is it? What's over there?" Lila's eyes met his, filled with a sorrow so deep it took his breath away. "Help me," she whispered. Before he could respond, she turned and walked towards the house, her form growing more translucent with each step. Evan hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to get back in the truck and leave, but he felt compelled to follow. The house loomed before him, its windows dark and empty. The door creaked open as he approached, revealing a dimly lit interior. Evan stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. "Lila?" he called, his voice echoing through the empty house. He followed her faint glow up the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The air grew colder, and he could see his breath fogging up in front of him. At the top of the stairs, Lila stood before a closed door, her form barely visible. Evan reached for the door handle, hesitating for a moment before turning it. The door swung open, revealing a small bedroom. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the walls were covered in dust and cobwebs. In the center of the room stood an old, rotting crib. Evan's heart sank as he approached it. Inside, he found a small, tattered blanket, stained with age. He picked it up, a sense of profound sadness washing over him. "Lila," he whispered, turning to face her. She stood by the crib, her eyes filled with tears. "I lost my baby," she said, her voice breaking. "I was trying to get home, but I never made it." Evan felt a lump form in his throat. He reached out to her, but his hand passed through her form, meeting only cold air. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Lila looked at him, her expression softening. "Thank you for helping me," she whispered. "Now, I can finally rest." With those words, her form began to fade, her sorrowful eyes the last to disappear. The room grew colder, and Evan felt a chill settle over him. He stood there for a long moment, holding the tattered blanket, before turning and leaving the house. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the town in a pale, ghostly light. Evan climbed back into his truck, his mind reeling from the night's events. As he drove away, the CB radio crackled to life once more. "Night Rider, this is Shadow Walker. You okay out there?" Evan picked up the microphone, his voice steady. "I'm okay, Shadow Walker. Just had a run-in with a phantom hitchhiker." "Glad you made it through," Shadow Walker replied. "Not everyone does. Safe travels, Night Rider." "Thanks, Shadow Walker," Evan said. "Safe travels to you, too." The radio fell silent, and Evan continued down the road, the sun beginning to rise on the horizon. The encounter with Lila had shaken him, but it had also given him a sense of purpose. He knew there were other lost souls out there, waiting for someone to help them find peace. As the first light of dawn broke through the fog, Evan felt a renewed determination. He would continue his journey, ready to help those in need, whether they were among the living or the dead. The road was long and filled with mysteries, but he was prepared for whatever lay ahead. The road through the mountains of West Virginia was a trucker's nightmare. Winding curves, steep drops, and sudden fog made it treacherous on the best of days. But for veteran trucker Mike Hastings, the route was just another challenge. Mike had driven this path countless times, hauling everything from coal to machinery. Yet tonight, an unshakable feeling of dread gnawed at him as he navigated the serpentine highway. The CB radio was his constant companion, crackling with static and intermittent chatter from other truckers. As he approached the infamous Black Hollow Tunnel, a relic of a bygone era, his unease grew. The tunnel had a dark reputation, whispered about in truck stops and rest areas, stories of ghostly apparitions, strange noises, and inexplicable occurrences. Mike glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Midnight. He could feel the weight of the night pressing in on him. He reached for the CB microphone, needing some human connection. Breaker 1-9, this is Road Warrior. Anybody out there? He called. Static greeted him, followed by a voice. This is Ghost Rider. You near Black Hollow, Road Warrior? Yeah, just about to enter the tunnel, Mike replied. Be careful in there. They say it's haunted. Saw something myself once. Keep your eyes open, Ghost Rider warned. Mike chuckled nervously. Appreciate the warning, Ghost Rider. I'll be on the lookout. He clipped the microphone back and focused on the road. The entrance to Black Hollow Tunnel loomed ahead, an ominous black maw in the mountainside. The headlights of his rig barely pierced the darkness within. Taking a deep breath, he steeled himself and drove into the tunnel. The walls closed in around him, the narrow passage amplifying every sound. The rhythmic thud of his tires on the uneven pavement echoed eerily. Mike flicked on his high beams, but the darkness seemed to absorb the light, rendering it almost useless. The tunnel stretched out before him, a seemingly endless void. Suddenly, the temperature inside the cab dropped sharply, and Mike shivered. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sharp. His breath fogged up in front of him, and he rubbed his hands together to ward off the chill. As he pressed deeper into the tunnel, a faint sound reached his ears. It was distant at first, barely audible over the rumble of his engine, but it grew steadily louder, a low, mournful wail that sent a shiver down his spine. Mike's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting from side to side. A flicker of movement caught his attention in the rearview mirror. He glanced up and saw a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the road behind him. It was tall and indistinct, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Mike's heart pounded in his chest, and he tore his gaze away, focusing on the road ahead. The wail grew louder, filling the cab with its mournful cry. Mike's breath came in short gasps, and he fought to keep his fear in check. He reached for the CB microphone, desperate for some reassurance. Ghost Rider, this is Road Warrior. I think I'm seeing things in the tunnel, he said, his voice trembling. There was a long pause before Ghost Rider replied. What are you seeing, Road Warrior? A figure, in the mirror. It looks like smoke, Mike answered, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror again. The figure was closer now, its shape more defined. He could make out a face, pale and twisted in agony. Get out of there, Road Warrior. Don't stop, don't look back, just keep driving, Ghost Rider urged, his voice filled with urgency. Mike's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. He floored the accelerator, the engine roaring as the truck surged forward. The wail intensified, echoing through the tunnel and filling his ears with its haunting cry. He kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look in the mirror. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness swallowing his truck and the ghostly wail growing louder with each passing second. Mike's mind raced, filled with images of the figure closing in on him, its eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. Suddenly, the headlights illuminated the end of the tunnel, a small, distant pinprick of light. Relief surged through him, but it was short-lived. The wail reached a fever pitch, and the temperature inside the cab plummeted further. Frost formed on the windshield, and Mike's breath came in ragged gasps. A loud bang echoed through the cab, and the truck lurched violently to the side. Mike fought to control the vehicle, his heart pounding in his chest. He risked a glance in the rear view mirror and saw the figure right behind him, its ghostly hand reaching for the back of the cab. Panic surged through him, and he floored the accelerator, the engine screaming in protest. The light at the end of the tunnel grew larger, but the figure was relentless, its wail a cacophony of despair and rage. The truck shuddered and groaned, but Mike refused to slow down. With a final, desperate burst of speed, the truck shot out of the tunnel and into the open air. The wail cut off abruptly, replaced by the roar of the engine and the rush of wind. Mike glanced in the mirror and saw nothing but the dark mouth of the tunnel receding behind him. He pulled over to the side of the road, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He took deep, shuddering breaths, trying to calm his racing heart. The chill in the cab began to dissipate, replaced by the normal warmth of the summer night. The CB radio crackled to life. "Road Warrior, you out of the tunnel?" Mike grabbed the microphone, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, I'm out." What the hell was that, Ghost Rider? I don't know, man, but you're not the first to see it. That tunnel's got a dark history. Accidents, disappearances, you name it. Best to avoid it if you can, Ghost Rider said. Mike nodded, though he knew Ghost Rider couldn't see him. Thanks for the warning. I'll make sure to steer clear of that place in the future. Good idea. Stay safe out there, Road Warrior. Thanks, Ghost Rider. You too. Mike clipped the microphone back and took a moment to collect himself. The night was still, the fog lifting to reveal a starry sky. He started the truck and pulled back onto the road, determined to put as much distance between himself and the tunnel as possible. As he drove, he couldn't shake the image of the ghostly figure from his mind. It haunted his thoughts, its twisted face and burning eyes seared into his memory. He had always been skeptical of ghost stories, but his experience in the tunnel had shaken him to his core. The miles passed in a blur, and dawn began to break on the horizon. The first rays of sunlight chased away the lingering shadows, and Mike felt a sense of relief wash over him. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure again. But there was nothing but the empty road behind him. He reached the next town as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Pulling into a truck stop, he parked his rig and climbed out, his legs shaky. He headed inside, craving the comfort of a hot meal and a strong cup of coffee. The diner was bustling with early morning patrons, the clatter of dishes and murmur of conversation a welcome contrast to the eerie silence of the tunnel. Mike found a seat at the counter and ordered a coffee, his mind still reeling from the night's events. As he sipped his coffee, he overheard a group of truckers talking at a nearby table. They were swapping stories, their voices low and conspiratorial. "Yeah, I heard about Black Hollow Tunnel. Spooky place," one of them said. Mike leaned over, curiosity getting the better of him. "You guys talking about the tunnel back there?" The truckers looked at him, their expressions wary. "Yeah, why? You seen something?" Mike nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he set down his coffee. "Yeah, I saw something. A figure, like smoke, and heard this awful wailing." The truckers exchanged glances, then one of them spoke. "You're not alone, friend. That tunnel's been haunted for years. Legend has it, a miner died in there during the construction. Got trapped in a cave-in and never made it out. Some say he's still looking for a way out." Mike shuddered, remembering the ghostly hand reaching for the cab. Whatever it wasn't friendly. "Best to avoid that place," another trucker said. "Bad things happen in there." Mike nodded, grateful for the advice. He finished his coffee and paid his bill, then headed back to his truck. The morning light felt reassuring, but he knew he would never forget the terror he had experienced in Black Hollow Tunnel. As he climbed into the cab and started the engine, he made a silent vow to steer clear of that haunted place. The road was long and full of dangers, but he would face them head-on, determined to keep moving forward. And as he drove away from the truck stop, he couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see the ghostly figure standing there. But the road behind him was empty, the only trace of the night's terror a lingering chill in the air. With a final shiver, Mike turned his eyes back to the road ahead, the rising sun casting a warm glow on the asphalt. He was ready to face whatever lay ahead, but he would never forget the haunted tunnel and the ghostly wail that had echoed through the darkness.
It was a foggy autumn night when Charlie Lawson, a long-haul trucker with a reputation for taking the toughest routes, found himself on the infamous Blackwater Bridge. The bridge had a dark history, known among truckers and locals alike as a place of tragedy and mystery. Stories of ghostly apparitions and eerie happenings were often shared around truck stop tables, but Charlie had always dismissed them as nonsense, until that night. Charlie had picked up a late delivery from a small town in Pennsylvania, headed for a distribution center on the other side of the state. He knew the route well, but an unexpected detour due to road construction had forced him onto the winding back roads that led to Blackwater Bridge. As he approached the bridge, the fog thickened, reducing visibility to just a few feet in front of him. The old iron bridge loomed ahead, its structure barely visible through the dense fog. Charlie felt a shiver run down his spine as he recalled the stories he had heard. The most famous tale involved a school bus that had plunged off the bridge decades ago, killing all the children and the driver. Since then, sightings of ghostly children and the sound of their laughter had been reported by those brave, or foolish, enough to cross the bridge at night. Charlie shook off the unsettling thoughts and focused on the road. His headlights barely penetrated the murky darkness, and he slowed to a crawl as he began the crossing. The fog seemed to close in around him, muting the sound of his truck's engine and creating an eerie silence. Halfway across the bridge, Charlie's radio crackled to life. At first, he thought it was just static, but then a voice broke through, faint and distant. "Help us." Charlie's heart skipped a beat. He glanced at the radio, but the voice was gone, replaced by the usual static. He shook his head, trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination. But then, he heard it again, clearer this time. "Help us, please." Charlie grabbed the CB microphone, his hands trembling. "Who's there? What's going on?" There was no response, just more static. He set the microphone down, his eyes darting around the cab. The fog seemed to be thickening, if that were possible. And an oppressive feeling of dread settled over him. He continued driving, eager to get off the bridge and put the unsettling experience behind him. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the middle of the road, illuminated by his headlights. Charlie slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding to a halt mere inches from the figure. His heart pounded as he peered through the windshield. A young girl stood there, her white dress torn and dirty, her eyes wide with fear. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Charlie's first instinct was to get out and help her, but something about the situation felt wrong. He rolled down the window and called out, Are you okay? Do you need help?" The girl didn't respond. Instead, she pointed towards the side of the bridge. Charlie followed her gaze and saw the twisted wreckage of a bus, half submerged in the dark waters below. His blood ran cold as the stories came rushing back. "Get in the truck," Charlie urged. "I'll get you to safety." The girl lowered her hand and looked directly at him, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to transcend her years. She shook her head slowly and whispered, "You can't help us." Before Charlie could react, she vanished, dissolving into the fog like a wisp of smoke. He blinked, trying to process what he had just seen. The truck's cab was suddenly filled with the sound of children's laughter, high-pitched and echoing, coming from all directions. Panic set in, and Charlie floored the accelerator, desperate to get off the bridge. As he sped forward, the laughter grew louder, more insistent. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the ghostly figures of children running alongside his truck, their faces pale and expressionless. The truck's engine roared as he finally reached the end of the bridge and barreled onto solid ground. The laughter faded, and the fog began to lift, revealing the dark, empty road ahead. Charlie pulled over to the side, his hands shaking as he cut the engine. He sat there for a moment, trying to calm his racing heart and make sense of what had just happened. His radio crackled again, and this time the voice was clearer, more urgent. "Help us, please. We're trapped." Charlie's mind raced. The wreckage of the bus, the ghostly children, everything pointed to the bridge's dark past. He knew he couldn't just leave without doing something. Taking a deep breath, he turned the truck around and headed back towards the bridge. As he approached, the fog returned, thicker than before. He parked his truck at the edge of the bridge and grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment. The iron structure groaned and creaked as he stepped onto it, the sound echoing through the mist. Charlie made his way to the side of the bridge, peering down at the wreckage below. The twisted metal of the bus glinted in the weak beam of his flashlight. He could see movement inside, shadows shifting and flickering. He climbed down the embankment, the fog swirling around him. As he approached the bus, he heard the sound of children crying, their voices muffled and distant. The sight of the wreckage was heart-wrenching. The bus was almost completely submerged, its windows shattered and its frame crumpled. "Hello?" Charlie called out. "Is anyone there?" The crying stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. He shone his flashlight into the bus, the beam cutting through the murky water. He saw the faces of the children, pale and ghostly, staring back at him from the shadows. "Please, help us," one of them whispered, their voice barely audible over the sound of the water lapping against the bus. Charlie's heart ached with a mixture of fear and compassion. He knew he had to do something, but he didn't know what. The children seemed trapped between worlds, unable to move on from the tragedy that had claimed their lives. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted, and Charlie stumbled, nearly losing his footing. He felt a cold hand grip his arm, and he turned to see the young girl from before, her eyes pleading. "You have to help us," she said. "We can't leave until someone sets us free." Charlie nodded, determination hardening his resolve. "What do I need to do?" The girl pointed towards the bus. "There's a locket in the driver's seat. It belonged to our teacher. If you find it and take it to the old church in town, we can finally be at peace." Charlie swallowed hard and nodded. "I'll do it." With the girl's guidance, he climbed into the wreckage of the bus, the cold water seeping into his boots. He made his way to the driver's seat, the metal groaning under his weight. There, tangled in the remains of the steering wheel, was a small silver locket. He grabbed it and climbed back out, the children watching him with hopeful eyes. As he made his way back up the embankment, he heard their voices again, soft and filled with gratitude. "Thank you." Charlie didn't stop until he reached the truck. He climbed into the cab and started the engine, the locket clutched tightly in his hand. He knew the old church the girl had mentioned. It was a few miles down the road, abandoned and forgotten. The drive to the church was a blur, his mind focused on the task at hand. When he arrived, he found the church in ruins, its once proud steeple crumbling and overgrown with vines. He made his way inside, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He placed the locket on the altar and stepped back, holding his breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a soft light filled the church, and Charlie heard the sound of children's laughter, this time filled with joy. He turned and saw the ghostly figures of the children, their faces no longer pale and sad, but radiant and happy. "Thank you, we are free now," the young girl said, her voice filled with emotion. Charlie watched as the children faded away, their spirits finally at peace. He stood there for a long moment, the weight of what had happened settling over him. He had done something good, something important. As he made his way back to the truck, the fog lifted, revealing a clear night sky. He climbed into the cab and started the engine, a sense of calm washing over him. The haunted bridge was behind him, and he knew he would never forget the children he had helped. Charlie drove through the night, the stars guiding his way. He felt a strange sense of connection to the road, to the stories and the legends that made it what it was. And as he drove, he knew he would carry the memory of the haunted bridge and the children he had freed with him, a reminder that sometimes, even in the darkest of places, there was hope. Jake Matthews was an experienced trucker who had been on the road for nearly 30 years. He thought he had seen it all until the night he encountered the ghostly convoy. It was a cold, moonless night as Jake hauled a load of industrial equipment through the remote highways of the Appalachian Mountains. The road was winding, and the darkness seemed to swallow the light from his headlights. Jake's CB radio crackled with static, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. He had tuned it to Channel 19, the trucker's channel, but it had been unusually quiet all night. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard, 2:15 a.m. Most truckers would be off the road by now, resting at truck stops or motels, but Jake was determined to make his delivery on time. The fog began to roll in, thick and white, reducing his visibility to just a few feet. Jake slowed his rig to a crawl, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The road was empty, the landscape desolate, and an unsettling feeling crept over him. Suddenly, the CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker 19, this is Shadow Walker. Do you copy?" Jake frowned. He had never heard of Shadow Walker before. He picked up the microphone. "This is Big Jake. I copy, Shadow Walker. What's your 20? Just ahead of you, Big Jake. You might want to slow down. There's a convoy up ahead, and it's not safe." "A convoy?" Jake echoed, puzzled. "I haven't seen any lights." "Trust me, you'll see them soon enough. Just be careful, and whatever you do, don't join the convoy." The radio went silent, leaving Jake with more questions than answers. He eased off the accelerator, peering into the dense fog. His headlights barely penetrated the gloom, and the road seemed to stretch on forever. Minutes later, Jake saw a faint glow in the distance. As he drew closer, he made out the shapes of several trucks, their taillights glowing eerily through the fog. The convoy moved slowly, almost too slowly, as if it were floating rather than driving. Jake's heart pounded as he approached the convoy. He couldn't see the drivers, and the trucks looked old, decades old. Their paint was chipped and faded, and their trailers were rusted and dented. Something about them felt wrong, deeply wrong. He reached for his CB microphone. "Shadow Walker, this is Big Jake. I see the convoy. What's going on?" There was no response, just a chilling silence. Jake's instincts screamed at him to turn around, but his curiosity and sense of duty pushed him forward. He followed the convoy at a safe distance, his eyes locked on the ghostly trucks ahead. The fog thickened, and the temperature dropped sharply. Jake shivered, his breath fogging up the windshield. He noticed something strange. The trucks didn't have license plates, and their headlights were dim and flickering. The lead truck suddenly veered off the road, followed by the others. They disappeared into the forest, their taillights winking out one by one. Jake hesitated, his mind racing. He knew he should keep going, stay on the main road, but something compelled him to follow. He turned his truck onto the narrow dirt path that led into the forest. The trees closed in around him, their branches clawing at the sides of his rig. The fog was even thicker here, and Jake could barely see the road ahead. The CB radio crackled again. "Big Jake, turn back now. You don't want to follow them." It was Shadow Walker, his voice urgent and desperate. Jake gripped the microphone. "What the hell is going on, Shadow Walker? Who are they?" "They're the lost souls of truckers who died on this road," Shadow Walker replied. "They're trapped in an endless convoy, reliving their final journey. If you join them, you'll be trapped too." Jake's blood ran cold. He had heard ghost stories before, but he had never believed them. Now, faced with the ghostly convoy, he wasn't so sure. "I can't just leave them," Jake said, his voice shaking. "There has to be a way to help them." "You can't help them," Shadow Walker said. "The best you can do is save yourself. Turn back now, before it's too late." Jake's mind raced. He knew he should listen to Shadow Walker, but the thought of leaving those souls trapped in eternal torment was unbearable. He took a deep breath and made his decision. "I'm going to try," he said, determination hardening his voice. "I can't just leave them." "Godspeed, Big Jake," Shadow Walker replied. "You're braver than most." Jake continued down the narrow path, his heart pounding in his chest. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees whispering dark secrets. The fog was so thick he could barely see his own hands. Suddenly, the path widened, and Jake found himself in a clearing. The ghostly convoy was there, the trucks arranged in a circle. Their headlights flickered and dimmed, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Jake parked his rig and climbed out, his breath fogging up in the cold air. He approached the nearest truck, its driver's seat empty. He glanced around, searching for any sign of life or death. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing through the clearing. "Can anyone hear me?" There was no response, just the creaking of the trucks and the rustling of the trees. Jake's heart sank. He didn't know what he had expected, but the oppressive silence was worse than anything he could have imagined. He reached for the door handle of the nearest truck, hesitating for a moment before pulling it open. The cab was empty, but it felt cold, as if the warmth of life had long since departed. Jake climbed inside, searching for any clue as to what had happened. As he rummaged through the cab, he found an old logbook. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with entries detailing the trucker's final journey. The last entry was dated over 50 years ago, and it ended abruptly, mid-sentence. Jake's hands trembled as he read the logbook. The trucker had been hauling a load through the Appalachian Mountains when he had encountered a dense fog. The last entry mentioned seeing a convoy of trucks, and then nothing. Jake climbed out of the truck, his mind racing. He had to find a way to break the curse, to set these souls free. But how? He turned to the other trucks, searching each cab for clues. Each logbook told a similar story. Truckers encountering the ghostly convoy and disappearing into the fog. The dates spanned decades, the entries growing more desperate and fearful. As Jake reached the last truck, he heard a sound that sent chills down his spine, the distant wail of a horn. He turned to see the lead truck's headlights flickering to life. One by one, the other trucks followed, their engines rumbling to life. Jake's heart pounded. He had to act fast. He climbed into the last truck, searching for anything that could help. His eyes fell on a small, weathered photo tucked into the visor, a family portrait, the trucker's family, smiling and happy. An idea struck him. He grabbed the photo and climbed out of the truck, holding it up for the ghostly convoy to see. "Your families are waiting for you," he shouted, his voice breaking. "You don't have to stay here. You can go home." The truck's headlights flickered, and the engines rumbled louder. Jake felt a surge of hope. He held the photo higher, his voice growing stronger. "Remember who you are. Remember your loved ones. You can be free." The lead truck's headlights blazed brightly, and then, one by one, the trucks began to fade. Their forms grew translucent, and the rumbling engines grew quieter. Jake watched in awe as the ghostly convoy disappeared into the fog, their spirits finally at peace. The clearing fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting from the air. He stood there for a moment, the photo still in his hand. He felt a deep sense of relief and accomplishment. He had done it. He had set them free. As he made his way back to his rig, the fog began to lift, revealing a clear, starry sky. He climbed into the cab and started the engine, a sense of calm washing over him. The CB radio crackled to life one last time. "You did it, Big Jake. You set them free." It was Shadow Walker, his voice filled with admiration. "Thanks, Shadow Walker," Jake replied. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Safe travels, Big Jake. And remember, not all ghosts are out to haunt. Some just need a little help finding their way." Jake smiled and set off down the road, the stars guiding his way. The ghostly convoy was behind him, but their memory would stay with him forever. A reminder that even in the darkest places, there was always a chance for redemption. As he drove through the night, Jake knew he had found a new purpose. He would continue to help those lost souls, guiding them to the peace they deserved. The road was long and filled with mysteries, but he was ready for whatever lay ahead. If you enjoyed the story, you can support me more by subscribing to this channel. Your support will help me to gather more stories like this from any places I travel to. Until then, stay safe. May the blessings of God be with you.